America's Road Not Taken. On June 12, 1776, George Mason, the principal author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, witnessed its formal adoption into law by the Virginia House of Delegates. This document was arguably the most politically revolutionary and influential the world had yet produced. 22 days later, at the convening of the Continental Congress, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence would echo Mason's words. It proclaimed that all men are by nature equal and endowed with the inalienable individual rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A new course for America and the world was set. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, adopted 250 years ago, did not merely catalog fundamental rights and liberties. It grounded them in human nature itself. Among those inherent rights was one that neither the Magna Carta nor the English Bill of Rights had articulated: the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property. Not simply property, understood by thinkers like John Locke as the legal rights and powers of ownership. The Virginia Declaration referred specifically to the means of acquiring property, what makes it possible for each person to actually acquire, own, enjoy, and control things that produce wealth. That word means is where American democracy has been failing for 2.5 centuries. We have celebrated the destination without following the road to get there. On the Virginia Declaration's 250th anniversary, one initial public offering, IPO, created history's first trillionaire. Wealth is concentrating at a speed that would have horrified Mason, while wars multiply along the fault lines of scarcity, exclusion, and monopolization. Accelerating that trend, artificial intelligence threatens to render tens of millions of workers at every level and in every field economically superfluous. The gap between Mason's promise and American reality has become a crisis that no conventional policy can bridge. But there is another road forward. It was mapped by a San Francisco lawyer and economist named Louis O. Kelso, and it runs directly to the heart of Mason's original vision, the Declaration that charted America's future. Mason's achievement is routinely undersold by history. Jefferson read the Virginia Declaration before he wrote a word of his own, and the family resemblance is unmistakable. But Mason went further than Jefferson in one crucial respect. Where Jefferson rendered the triad as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, an abstraction worthy of a founding document, Mason specified the economic mechanism by which the pursuit of happiness becomes tenable: the acquisition and possession of property, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Virginia Declaration of Rights, Article 1, June 12, 1776. Mason was not speaking theoretically, nor was he referring simply to the ownership of land. He was a working planter, a man who had spent his life owning and managing the productive assets of a Virginia estate. Those assets included other human beings, in direct contradiction of his stated principles proclaiming the equality of all men and the inherent right to liberty. Mason, however, understood in a way that more abstract philosophers could not that liberty without economic independence is a form of servitude dressed in better clothing. A man who cannot acquire and own capital, the non-human means of production, must sell his labor to those who own. His political liberty depends on their sufferance. His vote, no matter how legally free, is shadowed by the knowledge of who signs his paycheck. Simply put, own or be owned. This is not a Marxist argument. It is a Madisonian one. The framers feared concentrated economic power as much as they feared concentrated political power because they understood that the two are ultimately inseparable. Concentrated ownership divided people. 250 years later, the United States has constructed an economy that systematically narrows the means of acquisition to a small minority while offering the majority a consolation prize of wages, wages that have in real terms stagnated for half a century. The statistics are familiar enough to have lost their power to shock. The top 1% of Americans now hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The 8 wealthiest individuals on Earth possess more than the poorest half of humanity. This is not the natural result of free markets. It is the result of a specific, largely invisible bias in how modern economies are financed. When a corporation needs capital to build a new factory, purchase robots, or acquire a competitor, it does not ask its workers to save up and buy shares out of wages, wages that, after housing, food, health care, and other living expenses, leave little to spare. It borrows, collateralized by the value of the current shares of its existing shareholders. It issues equity. It accesses the capital markets, and the returns from those productive assets flow to whoever owns the existing capital. Those who now own will own the future capital. This is the closed loop that Mason's means of acquiring property was meant to break open, and that no conventional redistribution scheme can fix. Taxing the wealthy and transferring income to the poor does not make the poor into owners. It makes them more comfortable dependents. The productive capital, the machines, the algorithms, the platforms, the infrastructure remains in the same hands. The next technological advance simply concentrates it further. The breakthrough, democratizing access to the means. Louis Kelso, who died in 1991, spent his career asking a question that mainstream economics treated as naive. Why should capital ownership be a privilege of the already wealthy? What principle of logic, law, or justice requires that new productive assets be financed exclusively by and for those who already possess old productive assets? His answer, developed across several decades and 2 books co-authored with philosopher Mortimer Adler, was that no such principle exists. The restriction is institutional, not natural, and institutions can be changed. Kelso's central insight is sometimes called binary economics because it rests on a simple but profound distinction. In any modern economy, there are 2 separate but interacting factors of production: labor and capital. Human labor of all forms produces things of economic value. Non-human capital of all forms produces things of economic value. The question of justice is not merely how much value each produces, but who owns the capital that is producing an ever larger share of total output as technology advances. In an economy where machines do more and more of the work, the only way to make people prosperous is to make them owners of the machines. The mechanism Kelso developed to accomplish this is elegant in its simplicity. When a corporation needs capital for expansion, it should be possible, through properly structured, self-liquidating loans, for that capital to be acquired not only by existing wealthy shareholders, but by workers, community residents, and ordinary citizens, with the loan repaid out of the future earnings of the productive asset itself. The asset pays for itself, and once the loan is paid off, the new owners hold the new asset free and clear, with its future capital income flowing directly to them. Kelso's most celebrated practical application of this principle was the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, or ESOP, which he invented and which Congress eventually codified in 1974. Today, more than 6,500 ESOP companies in the United States employ over 14 million workers who own equity stakes in their employers. Studies consistently show that employee-owned firms are more productive, more resilient, and distribute their gains more broadly than conventionally held corporations. But the ESOP, as Kelso always insisted, was only a proof of concept. Kelso's full vision extends the financing principle to every citizen. CESJ, the Center for Economic and Social Justice, seeks to realize Kelso's vision in what is now called the Economic Democracy Act. Through individual capital ownership accounts, every citizen, every year from birth on, could acquire personal inheritable shares in the productive economy. These new assets would be acquired not through redistribution of existing wealth, but through access to future-oriented capital credit repaid from the earnings of the new productive assets. The world in June 2026 is visibly fracturing along lines that map almost perfectly onto the concentrated ownership of productive capital. There is a growing resentment, not always articulately or peacefully expressed, that the game is rigged, that the productive wealth of nations belongs to a vanishingly small class. Democratic institutions are increasingly seen as instruments for protecting that arrangement rather than challenging it. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence is compressing the timeline of this crisis dramatically. The displacement of cognitive labor that economists once projected across a comfortable 40-year horizon is arriving in a decade. White-collar workers who were told that education would protect them from automation are discovering that large language models can draft their briefs, analyze their spreadsheets, and write their code. The returns from this displacement, enormous, unprecedented, accelerating, accrue almost entirely to the companies and investors who own the AI infrastructure. We are, in other words, approaching the dead end of political democracy without economic democracy. It is hard to imagine that the omission of a few words is leading America to a future in which the means of production are so concentrated and so capital-intensive that the labor of ordinary people becomes structurally unnecessary, and in which those people have no claim on the output of the capital that replaced them. The economic and social consequences of that endpoint are not difficult to imagine. History has borne them out many times. A path to economic democracy. We can still reach a different destination. The solution is not to eliminate the machines and the AI, it is to own them. This is Mason's insight, recovered and given practical form by Kelso. The right to acquire property is meaningless without the financial architecture to exercise it. Mason declared the right. Kelso designed the architecture. We have only to build it. If every American citizen, not merely every American worker, but every citizen from birth, were provided equal access to capital credit through a properly structured system of capital ownership accounts and other ownership-broadening structures, the dynamic of the AI revolution would transform entirely. Rather than producing a small class of AI billionaires and a large class of economically superfluous former workers, it would produce a nation of owners, each holding a stake in the very productive forces that are reshaping the economy. The mechanism is not utopian, it is financial. The Federal Reserve's existing authority to provide liquidity for private sector investment, properly extended and redirected, could serve as the monetary foundation for broadly accessible capital credit and asset-backed money. Commercial banks, chartered specifically to serve this function, would extend loans to citizens' capital ownership accounts, citizen-owned land and infrastructure development corporations, and other ownership-broadening vehicles. Those loans would be repaid not with existing savings or subsidized with tax dollars, but with the earnings of the very productive assets they finance. The capital pays for itself. The citizens own the result. This is not redistribution. It is predistribution, opening up and universalizing new economic opportunities before wealth is created, rather than imposing a contested and corrosive rearrangement of wealth after the fact. The international implications are equally profound. A world in which productive capital is broadly owned is a world with structural incentives for peace. Wars over limited resources diminish when populations hold stakes in productive enterprise rather than scrambling for wage income in economies that can no longer employ them. The reconstruction of war-damaged regions, Ukraine, Gaza, the Sahel, becomes an opportunity to build ownership structures from the ground up, rather than simply restoring the concentrated patterns that produced conflict in the first place. Conclusion: America's ownership revolution. George Mason claimed that human beings possess by nature an inherent right to the means of acquiring property, not only the rights of property over things already possessed, but the actual functioning mechanisms to make capital ownership truly accessible to every citizen. We cannot preserve the blessings of liberty and democracy if we tolerate an economic system that disenfranchises most people. 250 years ago, Virginia gave America and the world a monumental blueprint for securing human dignity, freedom, and empowerment. George Mason's 8 words in 1776 point us toward a far different future than where we are traveling today. Louis Kelso provided a free market framework of economic justice, system reforms, and practical financial tools for democratizing capital credit. We now know how to provide every citizen with the means of acquiring and possessing property while protecting the property rights of every owner. Only then will we finally build a genuine and sustainable democracy where the pursuit of happiness is no longer a privilege of a few, but a tangible, secure reality for every person. This presentation has been brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice. CESJ, based in Arlington, Virginia, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational and research organization dedicated to the universal application of the principles of economic justice and binary economics, first articulated by Louis O. Kelso. For more information on the Economic Democracy Act, visit economicdemocracyact.info and csj.org.